Years ago, in the remote wilderness of Siberia, a man was sitting in his chair on the front porch of an isolated trading post, looked out towards the horizon, and took in the rays of the sun shining through the trees. As he was enjoying this view, it was abruptly interrupted by the sky itself, splitting into two with fire roaring miles above the forest. In disbelief, people stood still as they watched the sky continue to rip apart as the heat and brightness of the fire began to blind and burn those in its violent path. Then, as everyone braced for the end of the world and watched death itself approaching, the fire receded and the sky returned to normal. Join me in this episode as we look into when the apocalypse nearly happened, also known as the Tunguska Event. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. As always, I am your host, Jordan Hopkins. Today I'll be talking about the strange, massive explosion that took place in the Siberian wilderness near the Podkamenya Tunguska River. On an early June morning, a man by the name of S. Smednov was at the Vanavera trading post enjoying the start of his day by looking towards the forest in front of him, wondering what the day would hold. Though, what happened next, one could have never expected. It was around 7:17 a.m. when Smednov heard a loud crash coming from above, which caused him to look out beyond the trees, and to his horror, watched as the sky began tearing in two right before his eyes. A pillar of fire then shot upwards towards the rift, high above the tree line, and began to spread and torch the forest below. As the split in the sky continued to grow and the fire rushed through the trees, a shockwave of debris and air pushed past the pines and up to Smednov sitting in his chair. The force of the wave was so strong, it threw Smednov out of his chair backwards and flung him a few meters back. The air around him was now burning, and Smednov remembered how hot the air felt around him as it caused his shirt to nearly be unwearable, as it felt as if itself was on fire and burning his skin. And as he looked up from the ground and towards the sky, wondering if this was the end, the rift closed. Then Smednov's wife came running towards him and pulled him back towards their house. They felt the ground shake and heard the sounds of rock falling from the sky all around them. In total fear, they huddled together with their heads down, praying the large falling rocks around them wouldn't crush them both. The noise from the rocks sounded similar to hundreds of cannons firing all around them, and the trees began to bend and break under the large pelting they received. Feeling it was safe enough to get up now, Smednov, his wife, and others around him looked around at the devastation caused by this strange and horrifying event. Windows were all broken, crops in the fields were decimated, and everyone was bewildered at what had just happened. Smednov, his wife, and the other residents in the settlement weren't the only witnesses to this bizarre event. A tribe of Russian indigenous peoples known as the Shanyugur tribe tells stories of the event as well. When interviewed and questioned about their encounter by I.M. Suslov in 1926, a man named Chuchan gave a retelling of his and his brother's experience back on that day. He says when he and his brother were both sleeping in their hut, both were awoken to the force of a strong wind and the sounds of hundreds of birds flying overhead. As the two sat up in their sleeping bags, calling out for other family members but getting no response, another force of wind blew through the hut, knocking Chuchan over onto the smoldering coals of their hut's fire pit. He struggled a bit to get out of his bag and off the hot coals, but after he did, both him and his brother began to hear loud noise outside and all the trees around them bending and breaking. They tried to stand, but the ground shook violently and what sounded like thunder erupted from outside. Eventually, with such violent shaking and such powerful wind, their hut eventually collapsed with them trapped inside. Even though his body was trapped under the debris of his home, Chu Chan's head was spared and he was able to see the trees around him falling, with the branches burning, but was also partly blinded by such an intense light in the sky, as he described was as if there was a second sun. After this, as they were laying in the debris of their home, a second clap of thunder came bursting through the cloudless sky, causing the ground to shake even more, making it quite difficult for the two brothers to dig themselves free. It took some time, but the two managed to get free from their fallen home. But after they had, they looked up into the sky to see another flash of intense light, and a third thunderburst bellowed through the air, loud enough to shake the ground itself. Another burst of wind came again and pushed the brothers off their feet a second time, blowing the now fallen trees away from their roots, and even caused some boulders to roll across the landscape. The few trees that were left standing snapped, like the ones had before them, as fires began to spread and burn the wood to ash. Chu Chan's brother then pointed up towards the sky and shouted for him to look up. The two brothers stood in disbelief in all what had been happening as they watched another bright flash of light cross the sky, and a fourth thunderclap came seconds after, though they say this one was the faintest of the four. Both brothers quickly began searching for the rest of their family and trying to gain a sense of what was going on. They searched the remains of their ruined camp, which just minutes ago stood peaceful and secure, but now they were surrounded by devastation and the burnt ruins of their bountiful forest. As the ashes began to settle and the fires died down, those few in the area were met with destruction on a scale never before seen. An estimated 80 million trees were completely destroyed and wiped out in a matter of minutes, with the total area of destruction measuring up to roughly 2,150 square kilometers. Fortunately, with the event taking place in such an isolated area of the Russian wilderness, 0 deaths occurred as a result of the blast, but up to 3 deaths after the fact were suspected to have been linked to the after effects of the explosion emitted. For an example, this would be something like smoke inhalation or having been thrown into a tree or wall from the wind, causing internal bleeding or something along those lines. Basically something that would delay death a little bit longer. Either way though, scientists all agree if this explosion took place in a more populated metropolitan area like Moscow or St. Petersburg, it would have wiped out either of the cities and all of their occupants completely off the face of the earth. And with that being said, this explosion could have easily have been the deadliest natural disaster in human history. Now, as one might think, this sounds an awful lot like an atomic blast delivered by a bomb being dropped in this remote area. And one wouldn't be wrong to think this, as the description of the blast resembles one. The bright flash of light, the large clouds sending a pillar of fire into the sky, ear-deafening explosions, and intense burning winds throwing everything in its path distances one would have to see to believe. Well, the description is right, but the year is wrong. The explosion known as the Tunguska Event happened way back on June 30th of 1908, 37 years before the world's first man-made nuclear explosion took place in July of 1945. So with the Tunguska Event predating human capabilities of building atomic weaponry, what happened here? What could have created this apocalyptic event that was so massive? The seismic shockwave was registered with barometers as far away as England, over 5,500 kilometers away. Well, a man by the name of Leonid Kulik, a curator for St. Petersburg Mineralogical Museum, wanted to put together a scientific expedition to the isolated region where Ground Zero was located to find what the cause was for this event. Unfortunately, Kulik hadn't been able to chart his expedition until over a decade later in 1921, after the Russian political situation and World War I had prevented him from doing so for obvious reasons. In his first expedition, Kulik and his team went to the Podkamenya-Tunguska River Basin to begin their surveys. They were only able to stay for a short time and weren't able to venture into the center of the blast zone to conduct their field research. The isolated and rough terrain made it increasingly difficult for the team to trek, and Kulik was only able to reach the general area to see the destruction of the now old fallen trees firsthand. During this reconnaissance trip, the team also conducted several interviews with locals who witnessed the event to get a better understanding of what actually occurred here. But with limited gear and even more limited time at their backs, they were forced to leave prematurely before they got a real understanding of what had happened, though they did have a pretty good idea. It wasn't until 6 years later in 1927 did Kulik finally get his gear and team together again, and after convincing the Soviet government to fund his second expedition with the allure of gathering samples of meteoric iron, he was well on his way back to the blast zone. Upon his return to the area, Kulik hired local indigenous hunters to help guide him and his science team through the woods and towards the remains of the destroyed forest where the blast had occurred. It took some time, but they managed to make it to the edge of the blast zone where they gained a clear view of the obvious destruction. Though, when they looked upon their destination, a few members of the team became confused. From their theories and what they believed, they thought they would be met with the obvious signs of a meteor impact. But when they looked upon the recovering forest, they were confused why there was absolutely no impact crater. From what eyewitnesses claimed, the amount of destruction that was very evident, and the records of obvious readings of change in air pressure on barometers from several different countries, this meteor was guessed to have the destructive power of around 30 megatons of TNT, causing in turn an earthquake resulting in what was estimated to be around a 5 on the Richter scale. To remind everyone, this explosion took place back in 1908, 37 years before the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima were dropped. Now the Fat Man, the name for the nuclear bomb dropped on Nagasaki, had a blast yield of 21 kilotons of TNT, and the Little Boy bomb dropped on Hiroshima came in with a blast yield of around 15 kilotons of TNT. Both of these bombs wiped out hundreds of thousands of people in a second. So if we were to add the total kilotons of TNT from both bombs, we get a total of 36 kilotons. Now if we do a quick Google conversion, 1 kiloton equals to 0.001 megatons. The Tunguska event was estimated to be as big as 30 megatons. This would mean the meteor impact would have had the same combined power of 833 Little Boy and Fat Mans dropping all at once in the same spot. The destruction and size of the explosion would have been unfathomable for the time. Of course though, for those of you who know their bombs, the largest bomb ever detonated on Earth was the Tsar bomb back in 1961 and developed by the USSR. Now this bad boy came in around at 50 megatons, just for a frame of reference for how massive the Tunguska event was as a natural disaster. Which is why, when Kulik and his science team arrived at the site of impact, the lack of discernible crater was something that gave them brief pause and enlarged the questions they came to answer. But they knew they weren't going to solve the mystery by standing around and staring, so the team eagerly went to work on digging for meteor fragments and surveying the area. Although Kulik and his team spent several days searching and investigating, they weren't able to find any trace of meteor fragments anywhere on Ground Zero. Kulik then theorized the fact that they hadn't been able to survey the area until 19 years after the event might have meant that remnants of meteor fragments might have sank into the soft ground over the course of 2 decades. Kulik wrote that he believed if someone were to dig down several meters, one could possibly dig up remains of nickel ferrous iron weighing up to 1 or 2 metric tons. But with the blast zone radius being so incredibly large, it would have been increasingly difficult to narrow down a spot where to dig. So with little evidence of meteor fragments being found, and a lack of any impact crater, had more than a few people throughout the past 100 years scratching their heads as to what might have actually been the case for this explosion. The prevalent theory is that the explosion and the destruction it caused was evident of an airburst. An airburst being an explosion taking place high in the air rather than taking place on the ground. This would then explain a lack of crater. Back in 1908, the locals say they saw the sky splitting into 2 and fire bursting and spreading in every direction. This could have been them seeing the meteor speed through the air with a trail of fire behind it. This would have given those viewing the meteor from the ground to look up and see the sky burning and splitting into two as the fire from the meteor tail spread. The strong wind and sound of explosion could easily be explained too, as oftentimes when militaries consider dropping bombs on a target, airbursts are often considered as the explosion of the bomb can be just as deadly, but can cover a larger area, allowing shrapnel and the force of the explosion to cause serious damage. Though admittedly, airbursts aren't known for being able to demolish buildings or destroy vehicles if the target hides inside one or the other, so the conventional bomb would be much more desirable in that sort of situation. But in regards to the power of airburst, they are certainly capable of demolishing and ripping trees from their roots like in the Tunguska Event. So with this explaining the lack of crater and the severity of the blast, I think we can safely assume this is probably the most logical reason for what happened here in Russia back in 1908. But there are those in the scientific field who disagree with the cause. Some believe rather than a meteor flying through the atmosphere, it was actually a comet. Now, this would also make sense as comets can become quite large and are largely made of ice. This ice would then evaporate when careening through the atmosphere and down towards the ground. This would then explain the lack of any meteor fragments left behind by a supposed blast. Though depending on the size of the comet, it would need to have been massive to survive burning up in freefall and then causing enough force close enough to the ground to cause an airburst so large it destroyed over 2,000 square kilometers of forest. But, as I like to do with this podcast, I like to explore every possibility. So even though we already have the most likely and scientific explanation, I know many of you, including myself, like to hear about the more outlandish or pseudoscience side to things as well. This first explanation for the Tunguska event I'll share is a little bit of a different approach and one I wouldn't necessarily call pseudoscience, but I thought I'd quickly include it here before I go into other stuff. This theory was presented by astrophysicist Wolfgang Kundt, who offered up the idea that perhaps the explosion wasn't caused by falling space rock, but rather natural gas built up in the Earth. He proposed about 10 million tons of natural gas within the Earth's crust leaked out, then rose to its equal density height in the atmosphere. He then guessed the trail of gas drifted in the wind until it was able to find an ignition source, such as lightning, a campfire, or really any other flame. And this caused the spark to follow the long trail of gas to the large invisible cloud of gas waiting in the sky. While this would cause a massive explosion in the sky, it should have also led the flame down into the earth where the gas was leaking from and then igniting the gas still trapped under the ground. This though would have more than likely have caused a crater that is very much non-existent as we very much know. But who's to say not all the gas had already exited the crust and had fully collected in the air? Like I said, not exactly the most likely, but still an interesting theory nonetheless. Now we can move on to, let's say, less likely theories that have been thought up over the course of a century since the explosion. This next theory, we basically need to take a look into the small world around us. More specifically, into matter and the atoms that make them up. What we also need to look into, though, is antimatter. Now, antimatter is a material composed of antiparticles. It's widely believed that every particle around us has an antimatter partner that is identical to itself, but with the opposite charge. For an example, an electron will be a negative charge, but its antiparticle called a positron has the same mass but a positive charge. When a particle and its antiparticle meet, they completely destroy each other, disappearing in a burst of light and energy. It's been brought up, this was what happened in Russia that became known as the Tunguska Event. Though we have zero evidence to support this theory, but it's important to note, according to a quick Google search on my part, it says a gram of antimatter would be enough to produce enough energy similar to that of a nuclear explosion. Now, when I dug a little bit more into the depths of Google, humans, with our particle accelerators like the one used in Fermilab in the United States a few years ago, and currently in the Hadron Collider in Switzerland, we've only been able to create a few nanograms of antimatter, which amount to so little it would be equal to lighting a simple wooden match. This next theory is a short one, but it's been brought up by those who like to look into the more outlandish theories. It's one involving aliens and their spaceship. Now, I don't necessarily want to spend too much time on this one, mainly because there is zero evidence supporting it as well. But the gist of it is an alien spacecraft made a quick pit stop here at Earth and while they were here, either set off a bomb or launching of their spaceship created the blast. Like I said, there's not much to this one, but it has been a theory people like to talk about. It just really doesn't have much weight to it. These are probably the best ideas we got about what happened in the Tunguska event back in 1908, aside from the alien theory of course, but other than these, I can't really come up with another explanation for what happened there either. Russia has seen its fair share of meteor activity. Being the largest country in the world, along with so many people there having dash cameras in their vehicles, we are blessed with many incredible pictures and footage of bright lights falling from the sky. Probably one of the more famous recent cases of meteor falling from the sky takes us back to February of 2013 when the Chelyabinsk event occurred over the city of Chelyabinsk. What's nice about this meteor is that it was recorded by multiple dash, security, and phone cameras, allowing the footage to be fairly easily found on websites like YouTube or Google. In the footage, we're able to see how this meteor cut across the sky while burning, creating a flash so bright it probably caused a few people to squint while staring at it. But unlike the meteor in the Tunguska event, the Chelyabinsk meteor fell near a populated area, and the following shockwave it caused damaged 7,000 buildings across 6 cities, collapsing roofs and blowing out windows. And in total, there were roughly around 1,500 injuries due to the shockwave. Now let's compare this one with the one that took place back in 1908. The Chelyabinsk meteor was estimated to have a mass of around 13,000 tons and be around 20 meters in diameter, and at most gave off as much force as 500 kilotons of TNT, which then equals to 0.5 of a megaton. Now that we have a bit of a frame of reference for how destructive this meteor was at 0.5 of a megaton, try to imagine what size a meteor had to have been at to give off 30 megatons of force and how damaging that would be. Another point to be made here is that the Chelyabinsk meteor was the largest known object to have crashed through our atmosphere since the Tunguska event 105 years prior. I think we can all understandably believe why people who were there to witness the Tunguska event fully believed it was the end of the world. The Tunguska event always has been and always will be known for its strange description given by witnesses and the sheer destruction it brought down from the sky. Since this event, it's given everyone curious about the final frontier to keep a watchful eye for any more would-be apocalypses heading our way. The scary thing is though, the night sky is a large canvas. Even with all our high-tech telescopes and thousands of amateur astronomers keeping a watchful eye on the sky, there's always a chance of a large meteor slipping by and hitting our planet. Luckily, the majority of our planet's surface is covered in water, so the chances of a meteor large enough finding its way to our little planet and landing near a populated area is fairly small. Still though, we remain defenseless when it comes to protecting our world from asteroids, meteors, and comets. And if another meteor like the one which took out the dinosaurs ever happened to make a surprise visit here again, it would make the apocalypse created by the Tunguska event seem like a small candle. Hey everyone, stopping in here again at the end of the episode to thank you all for listening to Moonlight Lore. I really appreciate all your kind words, so thank you. If you would like, the podcast has an Instagram page where I post pictures about the topics I discuss here, and you can follow that on Moonlight Lore Podcast. I also have a Twitter account for the podcast, which I admittedly don't use very often, that one could follow for the occasional update, and that handle is @LoreMoonlight. And if you haven't already, please consider sharing the podcast with your friends and family. It helps spread the word and greatly grows the podcast. But even if you don't share it, I'm grateful for your support and listening, so thank you again. Until next time.